I remember the exact sound of his laughter. Light, dismissive, the kind of laughter people use to make cruelty sound like a joke. "This basement fits you," my son-in-law said, and everyone at the dinner table chuckled as if he'd just made a clever remark about storage space. I smiled too, because that's what women like me have learned to do when the room turns mean but polite. I smiled and looked down at my plate, pretending I didn't understand what he meant. But I did. I understood perfectly. He meant I belonged beneath them, below their lives, in the shadows where I couldn't embarrass them with my age, my thrift store sweaters, or my habit of telling stories no one asked for. He said it like it was a gift, a little joke wrapped in condescension, but it wasn't new. It was the kind of thing I'd been hearing in softer forms for years, through sighs, through silences, through all those sentences that start with, "Mom, maybe it's better if..." I am 81 now, and I live in the top apartment of a building with peeling paint and stubborn radiators that hiss like old men. From my window, I can see the street, the corner cafe, and the buses passing by, each one filled with people rushing somewhere they think matters. I drink my coffee slowly and watch them without envy. I own this building now. I bought it 3 years ago with a cashier's check that smelled faintly of ink and liberation. Sometimes I still think about the basement, its low ceiling, the smell of damp concrete, the single light bulb that trembled when the washing machine spun above me. I can still feel the chill that crawled through my bones in winter, the quiet humiliation of hearing laughter upstairs while I lay on a fold-out bed, surrounded by cardboard boxes labeled holiday decor and miscellaneous. That was my kingdom for almost 2 years, a space offered to me under the banner of generosity. They called it temporary, the same way people call a bruise minor. But it lasted long enough for me to forget the sound of my own footsteps on carpet, long enough to learn the small humiliations of invisibility. It started after my husband died. I fell. Nothing dramatic, just a small slip in the kitchen, and my daughter insisted I move in with them until you get your strength back. She said it with that efficient kindness she inherited from her husband, the kind that sounds like love but feels like management. Their house was large and bright, with tall windows and modern furniture that didn't like fingerprints. At first, I thought the basement was a temporary solution while they made space upstairs. I told myself not to complain. I even told friends on the phone, the few I still had, that it was cozy, that I liked the independence. I didn't tell them that there was no door, just a curtain. I didn't tell them about the way the baby monitor clicked every time someone upstairs moved, or how the air smelled faintly of detergent and apology. I didn't tell them about the morning I came up for breakfast and found a new lock on the thermostat. "It's just easier to keep it consistent for the baby," my son-in-law said. He was a man who said everything like he was explaining a technical feature, polite, practical, and without room for discussion. My daughter nodded behind him, her eyes tired but determined. She had learned long ago that agreeing quickly made life smoother. The first few weeks, I tried to be grateful. I cooked dinner when they were late from work, folded laundry, watered plants that didn't belong to me. Gratitude, I thought, was a form of survival. But gratitude doesn't keep you warm at night, and politeness doesn't stop the small erosions that wear a person down. The baby began to talk, to point, to name things. When I asked my daughter if she'd told her who I was, she said, "Oh, she calls you Mimi. It's easier." Easier for who? I wanted to ask, but I just nodded. I didn't want to make things complicated. Complicated was their word for anything that reminded them I was human. At night, when the house above me went quiet, I could hear the faint hum of their laughter, the rhythm of their lives continuing without me. I'd lie awake, listening to the pipes and the faint rustle of mice behind the walls. Sometimes, I'd whisper out loud just to remind myself that my voice still worked. "You're here," I'd say into the darkness. "You're still here." It sounded strange, that sentence, like a prayer to someone who had been misplaced. I'd close my eyes and imagine my husband sitting beside me, his hand resting on mine, his voice low and amused. "You always were too patient, Mara," he would have said. "Patience is a virtue until it becomes a trap." I should have listened to him. I remember one particular evening, a summer dinner with guests, the kind of people who use the word renovation like a verb for self-improvement. They toured the house, admiring the decor, the new appliances, the open concept kitchen. I sat quietly at the edge of the conversation until someone asked, half laughing, "And who lives downstairs?" That was when my son-in-law said it. "That's her domain," he chuckled. "Kinda poetic, isn't it? The basement fits her." The room erupted in laughter. My daughter glanced at me, her face pink with embarrassment. But she didn't say a word. She never did when it mattered. I excused myself to check on the laundry and went downstairs. Not crying, not even angry, just hollow. The kind of hollow that doesn't echo because it's already filled with resignation. Down there, surrounded by concrete and cardboard, I realized something I should have known long ago. They didn't see me as a person anymore. I was a relic, a symbol of obligation, a burden disguised as family. They thought they were generous for giving me shelter. I thought I was grateful for having it. We were both wrong. What they offered wasn't shelter, it was containment. What I accepted wasn't safety, it was silence. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked around the basement. The boxes, the old lamp, the suitcase I never unpacked completely. I touched the cool metal of the bed frame and thought, this isn't my ending. This is a waiting room. It's strange how quietly a person can disappear inside their own life. People imagine cruelty as loud, shouting, doors slamming, insults thrown like stones. But real cruelty often whispers. It says, "Don't worry, we're just thinking of your comfort." It smiles when it steals your dignity. It holds the door open and ushers you downstairs with kindness in its voice. That's how it happens. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until one day you realize that you've become a shadow in a house you helped pay for. You start apologizing for existing too loudly, for leaving your teacup in the wrong place, for taking up light and air. When people ask now how it felt to live there, I tell them the truth. The basement wasn't the cruelest part. The cruelest part, now, years later, when I stand on my own balcony watering the geraniums, I sometimes laugh at the irony. He was right, in a way. The basement did fit me, because I made myself small enough to fit inside other people's comfort. But walls can only hold you if you let them. And one day, when the air down there grew too thin to breathe, I decided I'd climb the stairs and not stop until I found a ceiling that belonged to me. I haven't looked back since. The day everything shifted began like any other, with the sound of footsteps above me and the soft thud of a cupboard closing somewhere in the kitchen. I was making my bed, smoothing the same faded quilt I had brought from my old house, the one with the tiny blue flowers that had once matched our bedroom curtains. There was something calming in the routine of order, of pretending the basement was simply another kind of home. I'd already finished the small chores I allowed myself, washing a few dishes before my daughter came down to remind me not to overdo it, folding the towels she left in the dryer because you like to keep busy. That morning, however, there was a different sound in her voice when she called my name from the top of the stairs. It wasn't unkind, but it carried the tone people use when they are preparing to deliver something unpleasant and want to frame it as an opportunity. She said, "Mom, can you come up for a minute? We want to talk about something important." I climbed the steps slowly, careful with my knees, though the real heaviness came from somewhere deeper than my joints. At the kitchen table sat my daughter, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and beside her, my son-in-law, already in his business clothes, scrolling through his phone as if the conversation ahead was merely an administrative errand. He began by saying how much they appreciated my help over the past couple of years, as though I'd been a visiting volunteer rather than the woman who raised the one sitting beside him. He mentioned the baby, how she was growing, how space was becoming limited, how the new playroom they'd been planning needed to come together before the summer. My daughter nodded in agreement, eyes fixed on the mug as if the steam carried answers she couldn't say aloud. Then came the phrase I still hear sometimes when I can't sleep. "We've been thinking it might be time to explore other options for you. Somewhere with people your age. Somewhere you'll have company." They said options like there were many, but I could tell they had already chosen one. My daughter reached for my hand, a reflex from the years when she still needed reassurance. But now it was me who needed to be calmed. "There's this place near the park," she continued softly, "a senior living community. It's really nice. They have gardens and classes and everything. You'd love it." I watched her mouth form the words as if she were reading from a brochure. I wanted to ask if she truly believed what she was saying, or if she was only afraid to imagine me staying. My son-in-law cleared his throat and added, "And don't worry about the cost. We'll figure it out." That "we" hung in the air like smoke. We, meaning them, meaning without me. For a moment, I thought I might laugh. Not because it was funny, but because of the absurdity of it. The idea that I had become an inconvenience in the house my savings had helped buy. I had been the one who wrote the check for the down payment when the bank wouldn't approve their loan without a larger contribution. I still remembered the pen, the way it hesitated above the line before signing, my husband's voice echoing in my mind. "Always keep something with your name on it, Mara." I did, though not enough. The deed was in a folder tucked away among their paperwork upstairs, the folder they never imagined I remembered. I looked at the two of them, their faces composed with the tenderness of people trying to soften a blow they'd already decided to strike. "You think I'd love it?" I said quietly, not as a question but as an observation. My daughter squeezed my hand again, and in her eyes I saw a flash of guilt, quickly buried under practicality. "Mom, it's just that the basement isn't really suitable anymore. We're planning to redo it, turn it into a gym, maybe add a wine cellar. It's nothing personal." The last sentence hit harder than any insult could. Nothing personal. As if my displacement were a matter of interior design. I stood slowly, pretending to stretch my legs, though what I was really doing was keeping my dignity from spilling out of me. "Well," I said, "it sounds like you've already made up your minds." My son-in-law smiled with professional relief, the way people do when a difficult conversation has gone smoother than expected. "We just wanted to give you time," he said. "There's no rush. Maybe a few weeks." I nodded. walked back toward the stairs, and descended into the place that was apparently no longer mine. Down there, the air felt heavier, as if the ceiling itself knew it had been relieved of duty. I sat on the bed and stared at the small lamp flickering beside me. There was no crying, not even trembling, just a quiet, surgical removal of illusion. I had told myself for so long that patience would eventually earn me kindness, that gratitude would protect me from neglect. But it turns out, silence only teaches people how to forget you faster. That evening, while they were out at dinner with friends, I climbed the stairs and went into the small office my son-in-law used when working from home. I knew the sound of that room by heart, the hum of the computer, the faint click of the printer, the sterile scent of ambition. In the bottom drawer of the desk, beneath folders labeled insurance, taxes, and home warranty, I found what I was looking for, a beige file marked Property Documents. Inside was a copy of the house deed, the one I'd signed 3 years ago. My name was there, printed clearly, though in smaller type below theirs. Still, it was there. Proof that I existed in more than memory. I placed my hand on the paper for a long moment, not out of sentiment, but to feel the texture of ownership again. Then I folded it carefully, slid it into my bag, and left the drawer exactly as I'd found it. The next morning, I walked to the corner cafe, the first time I'd been out alone in weeks. The air was bright and raw with early spring, the kind that makes you aware of your lungs again. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching strangers hurry past with purpose. On the table next to the sugar packets was a stack of free real estate guides, glossy covers advertising open houses and investment properties. I took one, partly out of habit, partly out of instinct. Flipping through, I saw pictures of places too large, too new, too cold. But then, near the back, a photo of a small 3-story brick building caught my eye. It wasn't perfect. The paint was chipped, and the windows needed repair. But something about it felt honest. The listing described it as multi-unit potential, structurally sound, priced for renovation. There was a phone number in bold print beneath the photo. I tore out the page and slipped it into my coat pocket, telling myself it was only curiosity. Yet, deep down, I knew curiosity had always been the first step toward escape. Later that week, my daughter mentioned she'd scheduled a tour at the senior residence. "Just to look," she said. "They have an art room, Mom. You used to love painting." I agreed to go, not because I intended to move there, but because I wanted to see how far they were willing to go to disguise abandonment as care. The facility was clean, bright, and filled with the smell of disinfectant and lemon. The woman giving the tour smiled too much, her voice a rehearsed melody of reassurance. "You'll make so many new friends," she said. "Everyone here feels like family." I nodded politely, thinking how that phrase had already lost all meaning in my world. When she stepped away to answer a phone call, I walked to the nearest window and looked outside. Across the street was a small park where a man was teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle. She wobbled, fell, laughed, and climbed back up again. Something in that image struck me with an almost physical force. There was effort, failure, and freedom all tangled together in that moment, and I realized I hadn't felt any of those things in a long time. That night, after my daughter drove us home, chattering about how nice the community seemed, I went down to the basement and began to sort through my belongings. There wasn't much to pack: clothes, a few books, a framed photograph of my husband holding a fishing rod and smiling against the sun. In a small tin box, I kept the savings bonds we had never touched. I did some quick calculations in my head. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to start. The decision arrived quietly, like a whisper that had been waiting years to be heard. I would leave, not as a protest, but as an act of reclamation. I would find that building, the one in the photograph, and I would make it mine. I didn't need permission. I didn't even need forgiveness. I just needed to stop living beneath people who called that generosity. When morning came, I left a note on the kitchen counter that said simply, "Thank you for everything. Take care of each other." No explanations, no accusations. I walked out carrying one suitcase and the folder with the deed. The sun was just rising, the light spilling across the pavement like the beginning of a new page. At the corner, I paused, looked back at the house, and felt no anger, only clarity. They had built a life that had no room for me, so I would build one that did. I took the bus to the address on the torn-out page and found the building exactly as it had looked in the photo. Weathered, stubborn, and waiting. The realtor was a young woman with a firm handshake and a tired smile. She began her practiced pitch about renovation costs and market value, but I stopped her halfway through. "I'll take it," I said. She blinked, surprised. "You haven't even seen the basement," she said, half laughing. I smiled, not missing the irony. That's the only part I'm not afraid of. When she handed me the papers to sign, I felt my hands steady for the first time in years. The pen didn't hesitate this time. The ink flowed easily, a thin black line between who I had been and who I was becoming. That was the moment of my return to myself. The quiet, final correction to a lifetime of being erased. In the first weeks after I signed the papers, everything felt both enormous and strangely silent, as if the world had paused to let me listen to my own breath again. I remember the echo of my footsteps as I first walked through the building alone, each creak and hollow sound marking the start of a territory that belonged only to me. The realtor's perfume still lingered faintly in the stairwell, a crisp citrus scent mixed with dust. But when the door shut behind her, what remained was pure quiet, thick, unfamiliar, and somehow alive. The ground floor smelled faintly of old varnish and something metallic. The walls were the yellow of years, not of paint, and the radiator by the window hissed as though surprised to be awakened. The basement, of course, was the part I dreaded yet needed to see most. It was smaller than I expected, with a single bare bulb that flickered as I descended. The air was cold, not cruelly so, but with the kind of chill that holds memory. I stood there a long time, staring at the cement floor, thinking of the other basement, the one I had left behind, and realized that this one didn't threaten me. It waited for me. There was a difference between being buried and being grounded, and for the first time in many years, I understood that difference in my bones. I wasn't beneath anyone anymore. I was at the foundation of something I would build. At first, I didn't tell anyone what I had done. My daughter's number remained in my phone. My son-in-law's laughter echoed occasionally in my head, but I refused to check the messages I knew were waiting. Instead, I began to clean. I scrubbed walls until the water ran gray, opened the windows, and let the cold March air rush through the rooms like a baptism. The building had 3 units, one on each floor. The top floor was the brightest, with slanted ceilings and a small balcony, so I chose it for myself. The others I decided to fix up and rent out eventually, though I had no clear plan beyond that. I moved slowly, but with certainty, like someone performing a ceremony of reclamation. Every nail I hammered, every inch of dust I swept, every crack I filled with plaster felt like an act of self-respect. The body remembers what it means to be useful, and mine, though worn, still knew the rhythm of purpose. The neighborhood was quieter than I'd anticipated, a forgotten pocket of the city where old houses leaned against one another for balance. There was a bakery on the corner that sold coffee thick enough to taste like memory, and a laundromat with faded signs that buzzed late into the night. The woman who owned the bakery, a sturdy figure with silver hair and red lipstick, introduced herself as June. When she heard I'd bought the brick building at the end of the block, she whistled softly and said, "That one's a project." I smiled and told her I liked projects. She nodded approvingly, the way women of a certain age recognize a kindred refusal to disappear. I began to stop by each morning for bread or conversation, whichever was more necessary that day. June had a way of speaking that made you feel like she'd already forgiven you for something you hadn't done yet. She never asked where I came from, only what I planned to do next. The days developed their own rhythm. I woke early, brewed coffee in a dented pot I found in one of the cupboards, and listened to the city stirring awake. Sometimes I worked on the apartment walls, scraping off layers of old wallpaper to reveal the plaster beneath. Other times, I wandered through secondhand stores, collecting things that felt solid: an oak table, a lamp with a brass base, a set of dishes mismatched but honest. Each object I carried home felt like a small declaration. I am still here, and I still choose. The money dwindled faster than I expected, but I had enough to keep going. I wasn't afraid of less anymore. I had lived with less dignity before, and that was far more expensive. The first letter arrived in late April, forwarded from my old address. It was from my daughter. The envelope was thick, her handwriting careful but strained. I placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was not fury or apology, but confusion. "Mom," it began, "we came home and you were gone. We don't understand. We thought you were happy here. Please call us. We're worried." I read it twice and then folded it back neatly. The words, "we're worried," caught in my throat, not because they were true, but because they arrived too late to matter. Worry is only love remembered too late. I placed the letter in a drawer with the others that would follow in the coming weeks, each one more desperate, more performative, as though concern could erase intent. I didn't reply. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Instead, I threw myself into work. There was something deeply satisfying about peeling away old wallpaper and finding hidden patterns beneath. Floral ghosts from the 1950s, geometric lines from the 1970s, each layer a conversation between time and neglect. I thought of my life the same way: layers of patience, politeness, compromise. Each strip I tore down revealed something older, simpler, truer. The building began to change with me. The rooms grew lighter. The air, once heavy with disuse, began to breathe. I painted the walls a color I couldn't quite name, somewhere between cream and dawn, and when the light hit it at noon, it looked almost alive. One evening, while carrying down a box of tools, I lingered again in the basement. The air smelled faintly of earth and rust, but there was a warmth to it now, the scent of potential. I decided then to keep the basement unfinished. I would store things there, yes, but I wanted to preserve that rawness, the reminder that everything built above it stood on something real, something unpolished. I brought down a chair, an old lamp, and a small radio that barely worked. It became my quiet place, a sanctuary for thought. Sometimes I sat there and imagined the sound of laughter from the old house, not as pain, but as proof that I had survived it. I realized the most dangerous thing about humiliation isn't the moment it happens, but the way it tries to define the rest of your life. The only way to fight it is to rewrite it. By early summer, I rented out the first floor to a young couple who worked night shifts at a hospital. They paid on time, smiled politely, and never asked questions. Their presence gave the building new energy. The second floor I kept empty, though I often stood in its doorway and imagined who might live there. A teacher, a widow, maybe another woman like me who needed a place to breathe. I wasn't ready to fill it yet. Some spaces, I've learned, must stay empty for a while before they can welcome anything true. In July, I received another letter, this time from my son-in-law. His handwriting was precise, businesslike. He wrote that they were concerned about my well-being and that they'd spoken to an attorney just in case. He mentioned assets, responsibility, the importance of transparency. It was a letter pretending to be care, but written in the language of control. I read it once, smiled faintly, and tore it in half. The sound of paper splitting was softer than I expected, almost gentle. I felt no rage, only release. I burned the pieces later that evening in an old tin pail on the balcony, watching the smoke drift upward like an unspoken prayer. Below, the city glowed in the fading light, unaware that a woman had just claimed her own name back from oblivion. It was around that time that the first cracks in my resolve appeared, not doubts, but memories. Sometimes I woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I'd hear footsteps on the stairs, a voice calling my name with that careful irritation that had become so familiar. But there was only silence, the kind of silence that doesn't accuse but forgives. I began to walk more, to learn the rhythm of the neighborhood streets. There was an old park nearby where children played in the afternoons, and sometimes I sat on a bench just to feel the pulse of life around me. It reminded me that freedom isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or applause. It's quiet, steady, and often lonely at first. Still, the past found small ways to reach me. One afternoon, I was in the bakery when June handed me a folded section of the local newspaper. "You might want to see this," she said gently. On the inside page was a small column titled "Missing Matriarch," describing a woman in her late 70s who had disappeared from her family home. There was even a photograph, me, smiling awkwardly at a barbecue, holding my granddaughter when she was still a baby. The article quoted my daughter saying they just wanted her safe. I read the words without flinching. It was strange to see my absence turned into public drama, as if concern could absolve abandonment. June watched me carefully, perhaps waiting for tears. Instead, I folded the paper, handed it back, and said, "They finally noticed I was gone. That's progress." She didn't laugh, but her eyes softened. "Some people only miss you when you stop being useful," she said. "The rest of us know better." By the end of that summer, the building no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited by something invisible but solid. Dignity, maybe, or peace. The walls no longer echoed, and the rooms carried the faint scent of fresh paint and coffee. I sometimes caught myself humming while sweeping the floors, an old habit from years ago. The rhythm of it filled the space, grounding me. I realized I didn't need forgiveness from anyone above me or behind me. What I needed was the sound of my own voice, steady and sure, rising through the floors like sunlight through dust. I had once lived in a basement built on someone else's comfort. Now I stood at the top of a building that carried my name, my labor, my story. And though I knew the past wasn't finished with me, I was no longer afraid of what it could take. The first escalation had already begun, not a conflict, but a transformation, the quiet widening of a life that had been kept too small for too long. Autumn came slowly that year, like a curtain being drawn one careful inch at a time, and with it came a strange kind of steadiness I hadn't felt in decades. The city changed color. The air thickened with wood smoke and rain, and the building that had once seemed too large for me began to feel like an extension of my own breathing. I had by then repaired most of what I could afford to fix, replaced the old pipes that clanged in the night, painted every window frame by hand, and furnished my apartment with a kind of modest pride that reminded me of my first home with Derek. Every evening, after the tenants downstairs had turned off their lights, I would sit by my window with a cup of tea and watch the streetlights flicker on, feeling both invisible and entirely present. It was a balance I hadn't known was possible. For the first time, my life felt quiet, not because it had been silenced, but because it was full of peace. Yet in that calm, another part of me began to stir, the one that had always been waiting to see what might come next, the one that refused to end in stillness. The building inspector, a man named Harris, came by one morning to finalize a routine check. He was in his 60s, tall, slightly stooped, with eyes that had seen too many unfinished projects and too few happy endings. He walked through the apartments with professional disinterest until he reached the top floor. "You did all this yourself?" he asked, running a hand along the freshly painted doorframe. I nodded, suddenly self-conscious of the imperfect lines I'd tried to smooth over. He let out a low whistle. "Well, you've got good bones, lady," he said. "The place, I mean. But you too, I guess." I laughed, the sound coming out rusty from disuse. It had been a long time since anyone had said something kind without an agenda. When he left, I stood at the window for a while, watching him walk down the street, and realized that I had started to take up space again, not just physically, but emotionally, the way sunlight takes up a room when no one is trying to close the curtains. It was around that time that I decided to open the second-floor unit, not to rent, but to use as something else. I wasn't sure what at first, only that I wanted it to have purpose beyond profit. I cleaned it thoroughly, swept out the last of the renovation dust, and placed an old armchair near the window. Then I began to bring in books from my apartment, memoirs, cookbooks, poetry collections, all the things I had loved and never shared. Soon the room took on the feel of a sanctuary, not a library exactly, but a space meant for women like me, the ones who had been told to stay quiet or out of sight. I started small, an open door every Thursday afternoon, a pot of coffee on the stove, and a sign on the door written in my own hand that read simply, "Come in if you need a chair." The first few weeks, no one came. I would sit there reading or listening to the hum of traffic, content to wait. Then one day, a woman appeared in the doorway. She was in her 50s, thin, nervous, with a bruise fading near her temple. She didn't say her name, and I didn't ask. She sat down, took the mug of coffee I offered, and stared out the window in silence. After a long time, she said, "He told me I make everything harder than it needs to be." I said nothing. She took a slow breath, as though she hadn't had permission to do so in years. When she finally left, she placed a small paper bag on the table. Inside was a loaf of bread she had baked herself. I didn't know where else to bring it, she said. After that, she came every Thursday. Word spread quietly, not through announcements, but through whispers, the way hope always travels best. Soon there were others, an older neighbor whose children had stopped visiting, a young mother who needed 10 minutes of silence between shifts, a retired nurse who confessed that she no longer recognized herself without a uniform. They came and went, never in groups, always one by one, drawn by something I hadn't planned to create but couldn't stop nurturing. We didn't talk about miracles or forgiveness. We talked about grocery prices, about old movies, about the best way to keep a plant alive in winter. It was ordinary conversation, but in that ordinariness, there was healing. The second floor began to smell of cinnamon and raincoats drying on radiators. Sometimes we just sat in silence, and it was enough. One evening, as I was locking up, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a clipping from the same local newspaper that had once declared me missing. This time, it wasn't an article about me, but about an initiative in the neighborhood to support independent elder living. Someone had scrawled across the top in blue ink, "You're the reason we started talking about this." There was no signature. I smiled, folded the clipping, and placed it in the drawer with the others I'd kept. Letters, fragments, tokens of the life I was rebuilding one gesture at a time. I had not expected that by saving myself, I might give permission to others to imagine saving themselves too. The thought frightened me a little. Responsibility, after all, had been the weight that once buried me. But this new version felt different. It wasn't obligation. It was witness. Sometimes the most radical act a woman can commit is simply to live in a way that contradicts her erasure. By winter, I had become a familiar face in the neighborhood. People waved as I passed, the children called me Miss M, and the young couple downstairs began to leave me small gifts: fresh bread, flowers, once even a note that said, "Thank you for keeping the lights warm in this building." Those words made me laugh, not because they were poetic, but because they were true. I had indeed been keeping the lights warm, tending to them like a quiet guardian. It made me think of my old basement again, how the light there had always trembled, how every small comfort had felt borrowed. Now I moved through rooms that held light steady, that refused to flicker. I was not naive. I knew that safety is temporary, that life has a way of testing what we build. But I was ready for those tests now. They would not find me unprepared. Then one day, a letter arrived that unsettled the fragile peace I had made. It was from my granddaughter, the one I had not seen since she was a toddler. The handwriting was awkward, slanted, full of crossings out. "Grandma," it read, "Mom and Dad said you moved away because you were sick, but I don't believe them. I looked you up online and found an article about a missing woman who looks like you. Are you okay? Please write back." The paper smelled faintly of the perfumed stationery my daughter used to buy. I read the letter several times, tracing the uneven lines with my finger. I could almost hear her voice, uncertain but brave, trying to reach across the silence her parents had built between us. For the first time in many months, I felt a crack inside the calm, a small ache that wasn't about anger or fear, but longing. I wanted to answer, yet I didn't know what truth to give her. That I was happy now, yes, but that her mother had tried to turn me into an artifact? That love had become a transaction in that house? I folded the letter gently and placed it beside my teacup. Some truths, I thought, have to be delivered in person. That night, I went down to the basement, not to hide, but to remember. The air was cool, the light soft from the single bulb. I sat in the old chair, the one I had placed there on my first day, and listened to the quiet hum of the pipes. I thought of how far I had climbed, how each floor above me had marked another layer of return. The building, I realized, wasn't just a home. It was a map of my becoming. The basement was what I had endured, the ground floor what I had rebuilt, the second floor what I had shared, and the top where I had finally allowed myself to rest. I closed my eyes and whispered to the walls, half smiling at my own foolishness, but also knowing that they heard me. "You did not defeat me," I said softly, to the past, to the laughter, to the son-in-law who thought a basement was the right measure of a woman's worth. "You only helped me remember what it means to rise." Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, carrying the scent of rain. I stayed there a long while, until the cold began to seep through my shoes, and when I finally went upstairs, I felt lighter, as if the ghosts that had lingered in the cracks of my story had finally grown tired of haunting me. The next morning, I wrote a short note to my granddaughter. "Yes, sweetheart," it said. "I am safe. I am happy. One day, when you are ready, come find me. I'll be the one in the house that smells like coffee and courage." I signed it not as Mimi, not as mother, but simply as myself. Then I walked to the post office, the letter trembling slightly in my hand, and when I dropped it into the blue box, it felt like releasing a bird I had nursed back to health. The air was cold, the sky colorless, but I felt something inside me bloom again, quiet but unstoppable. I had spent a lifetime in other people's shadows. Now I was learning the contours of my own light. The letter to my granddaughter marked the beginning of a new kind of restlessness, one that didn't come from fear or loneliness, but from the quiet, insistent knowledge that life was about to tilt again. I could feel it the way animals sense storms before the clouds appear, a subtle tension in the air, a hum under the skin that wouldn't fade no matter how often I swept the floors or brewed another pot of tea. For a few weeks, nothing outwardly changed. The women still came on Thursdays. The tenants still paid rent on time. The evenings still ended with the faint hum of the radio and the sigh of my old radiator. But inside that peaceful rhythm, something was gathering, a pressure I couldn't name. Then, one ordinary morning in late March, it arrived. The past, polite as ever, knocked first. It was a letter, this time on the crisp stationery of a law office, the kind that smells faintly of toner and authority. The name printed at the top meant nothing to me, but the first sentence drained the warmth from the room before I finished reading it. "Dear Mrs. Harrow," it began, "I represent your daughter and son-in-law, who have expressed concern regarding your current living arrangements and mental well-being. They wish only to ensure your safety and to discuss the management of certain shared assets." The language was as careful as a surgeon's hand, the kind designed to wound without leaving visible scars. The letter concluded with an invitation to open dialogue in the spirit of family reconciliation. I set it down on the table, my fingers leaving faint marks on the paper. For a long moment, I said nothing. The kettle hissed on the stove, but I didn't move to stop it. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn sounded, ordinary and cruelly indifferent. When I finally reached for the kettle, it was boiling over. I poured the water anyway, watching the steam rise like smoke from a slow, deliberate fire. I had known, of course, that they would find me eventually. Pride, control, and performance were too deeply woven into my daughter's marriage for them to simply let me vanish. What I hadn't expected was the civility of the assault. They weren't coming with guilt or apology, they were coming with paperwork and concern. Concern is the polite mask cruelty wears in public. I didn't reply that day or the next. Instead, I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer beside the others, though this one felt heavier, as if the ink itself had been mixed with something poisonous. That evening, I went downstairs to check the mailboxes and found a small package tucked inside mine with no return address. Inside was a photograph. My granddaughter, now nearly grown, sitting at a piano, her hair pulled back, her expression serious. On the back, written in her uneven hand, were the words, "I got your letter. Mom doesn't know. I'm proud of you." I pressed the photo against my chest and stood there for a long time, the sound of the radiator and the rain outside merging into one long, low heartbeat. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I had been holding my breath since leaving that house. The letter from the lawyer had reminded me that I was still vulnerable, still visible to those who once defined me. But my granddaughter's note reminded me that not all inheritance is poison. Some of it is courage passed quietly through bloodlines, waiting for the right moment to wake. The next few days blurred into a cautious rhythm. I went about my work in the building, fixed a leak in the kitchen sink, mended a tear in the stairwell carpet, and tried not to think about what might come next. Yet, every time the phone rang, my body stiffened. I had never been afraid of confrontation, not really, but I had learned that confrontation rarely delivers justice. It simply reveals who already believes they deserve to win. On the fourth day, the phone did ring, and this time, I answered. The voice on the other end was young, male, professional, the tone clipped but courteous. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "this is Derek Sorensen from Whitfield and Klein. I sent you a letter last week. I wanted to ensure you'd received it." I said I had. "Wonderful," he replied, with the false warmth of someone reading from a script. "Your family is deeply worried about you. They just want to make sure you're comfortable. Perhaps we could schedule a time to meet?" I told him I was perfectly comfortable and didn't require a meeting. There was a pause, then a faint rustle of paper. "If I may, ma'am, it would be helpful to clarify your intentions regarding certain financial accounts and property interests. Purely a formality." His voice softened on that last word, as if coaxing a reluctant child. I almost smiled. "Mr. Sorensen," I said evenly, "tell my daughter and her husband that I am not a line item they can audit. I'm a person, and I do not give permission for anyone to act on my behalf." Before he could respond, I hung up. My hand trembled slightly, but not from fear, from fury held steady. By the end of that week, the article appeared. A neighbor slipped it under my door without a note, just a quiet act of warning. The headline read, "Elderly woman still missing. Family appeals for help." My photo stared back at me, the same one they'd used before, cropped now to make me look smaller, fragile, pitiful. The quotes from my daughter and son-in-law were the same chorus of self-justification, dressed as love. "We just want her safe," my daughter said. "She's vulnerable." That word, vulnerable, made my teeth clench. Vulnerable is what people call you when they want to justify taking control. I sat at the kitchen table, the article spread before me, and for the first time since leaving that house, I felt something close to rage. Not hot, reckless rage, but the deep, cooling kind that moves with purpose. I realized they weren't trying to find me because they missed me. They were trying to find me because they couldn't stand that I had escaped without permission. Freedom, to people like them, looks like madness when they're not the ones who granted it. That night, I walked through every room of the building, checking locks, closing windows, touching the walls as if to remind them that they were mine. The moonlight pooled on the hardwood floors, soft and silver, and I thought of how many years I had spent making myself small, obedient, palatable. I remembered the exact tone my son-in-law used when speaking to me in front of others, that patient, performative civility that disguised disdain. "She's set in her ways," he would say, and the room would nod in sympathetic agreement. Now I wanted to call him and say, "Yes, I'm set in my ways, finally, and they're mine." But I didn't. Instead, I wrote a letter to his lawyer. It was short, formal, and absolutely clear. I am of sound mind, in possession of my assets, and under no duress. Any further attempts to interfere with my affairs will be considered harassment. I am represented by local counsel. I didn't have local counsel, of course, but I intended to. And even before I found one, I knew the letter would serve its purpose. People like him only respect boundaries when they're written on expensive paper. The days that followed were oddly peaceful, the calm that often comes after a woman finally decides she's done being polite. I found an attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara, who didn't flinch when I explained the situation. She had seen it before, she said. Adult children trying to wrap their parents in the language of protection while reaching for the keys to their lives. "You've done the right thing," she told me. "You don't owe them explanations. You owe yourself peace." She drafted a simple notice of independence, notarized it, and had a copy delivered to the law office. It was a small act in legal terms, but symbolically, it was everything. That paper became the final brick in the wall between who I had been and who I was becoming. And yet, life has a way of testing conviction. A week later, while I was tidying the second-floor sanctuary, I saw a familiar figure standing on the sidewalk outside, a woman in a tailored coat, her posture too controlled to belong to anyone but my daughter. For a long moment, she didn't move. She just stared at the building as if it were a mirror reflecting something she couldn't bear to see. Then she walked away. I didn't chase after her. I knew she'd be back, though, because guilt never travels alone. It brings control as its companion. The next time she came, she didn't stand outside. She walked straight into the bakery next door where June worked and waited until I appeared for my morning coffee. "Mom," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "Can we talk?" June, perceptive as ever, wiped her hands and disappeared into the kitchen. We sat at a small table by the window. My daughter's hands were trembling slightly, though her manicure was perfect. "I didn't know about the lawyer until after he sent the letter," she began. I raised an eyebrow, not unkindly. "And yet you haven't told him to stop." She sighed, looked away. "You just disappeared. What were we supposed to do? People think we abandoned you." There it was, the fear of reputation masquerading as concern. I leaned back and studied her face, the same eyes that once looked up at me for comfort, now searching for absolution. "Maybe," I said quietly. "People are finally seeing the truth." She flinched as if I'd struck her, then whispered, "You're being cruel." I almost laughed. "No, dear. I was cruel to myself for 50 years. Now I'm simply being honest." She started to speak again, but stopped when the doorbell above the bakery jingled and June returned with 2 cups of tea. My daughter stood abruptly. "You've changed," she said, half in awe, half in accusation. "That's what living your own life does to a person," I replied. She left without finishing her tea. That encounter might have been the end of it, but a week later, a new letter arrived, this time handwritten. It was from my granddaughter again. "They're angry," she wrote. "They said you embarrassed them, but I told them they don't get to decide what you do. I'm going to visit you when I turn 18. I don't care what they say." I read those words over and over until they blurred. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. The legacy of silence had been broken. Whatever chains had bound me to that basement, they had snapped across generations. The sound of freedom doesn't echo, it multiplies. Still, one final confrontation remained, and I could feel it approaching like thunder. It came on a gray afternoon when a black car pulled up outside the building, and a man in a suit stepped out. It was the lawyer, Mr. Sorensen. He rang the bell, waited, then knocked. I opened the door before he could start his rehearsed speech. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "forgive the intrusion, but your family—" I cut him off. "My family knows exactly where I am. They just don't like that it's not under their roof." He shifted awkwardly, holding a folder in front of him like a shield. "If you'd allow me a few minutes—" "You've had enough," I said. "Go back and tell them I'm not their property, not their publicity problem, not their fragile ghost. Tell them I live in a house with light in every room. Tell them I own it. Tell them the basement fits me just fine now that I choose what stands above it." He hesitated, nodded once, and left. When the car drove away, I stood at the window watching the street until the taillights vanished into the distance. The storm, it seemed, had finally spent itself. That night, I made myself a simple dinner: bread, soup, and a small glass of wine, and sat by the window while the city lights blinked like tired eyes. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel like an absence. It felt like ownership. The second escalation had ended, not with noise, but with clarity. I understood now that peace was not the opposite of conflict. It was the prize of having survived it. I turned off the light, the reflection of the room fading into the glass, and whispered to my own shadow, "You've done enough hiding. Let them look for you as long as they need. You're not lost. You're free." The morning of the signing began with rain that sounded like static against the windows, steady and unhurried, the kind that seems to wash the world clean without ever intending to. I woke before dawn, not from worry, but from anticipation, the way I used to wake on the first day of school as a child, with the strange awareness that something would be different by nightfall. The building was quiet, the tenants still asleep, the pipes humming faintly through the walls like an old memory breathing. I brewed coffee, strong and dark, and stood by the kitchen window, watching the street glisten under the early light. The trees outside swayed as if whispering, and for a moment I allowed myself the indulgence of imagining that the city itself knew what was about to happen, that after so many years of compromise and erasure, I was at last going to make something irrevocable. I thought of Derek, of the day we bought our first house, of the way he placed his hand over mine as we signed the mortgage papers, whispering that everything real begins with a signature. I had forgotten that feeling until this morning, the quiet authority of putting your name to something that no one can take back. I dressed carefully, not out of vanity, but ritual. I chose a wool coat the color of rain clouds and pinned my mother's brooch on the lapel, a small silver bird in flight. It had been hidden in a drawer for years, waiting for a day that deserved it. I checked my bag twice, making sure the documents were inside. The letter from the lawyer, the notarized statement Clara had drafted, the deed of the building, my identification, and one small photograph of my granddaughter folded neatly between the pages of my notebook. I wasn't sure why I brought it. Perhaps I wanted to carry something of the future with me, a reminder of what this moment was really for. I locked the door behind me and descended the stairs slowly, listening to the creak of the steps, the echo of my own presence in the space I had rebuilt. The air smelled faintly of dust and warmth, and by the time I reached the street, the rain had slowed to a fine mist. The attorney's office was only 6 blocks away, but I took the long route, passing by the bakery where June was already arranging loaves in the window. She looked up, saw me, and smiled. "You look like a woman with a purpose," she called through the glass. I smiled back, nodding. I didn't tell her where I was going, but she seemed to understand anyway. There are women who speak in sentences, and there are women who speak in silences. June and I had learned each other's language without needing translation. When I arrived, the receptionist greeted me with polite efficiency. "Mrs. Harrow? Ms. Ruiz is expecting you." The waiting area smelled of paper, lemon polish, and the faint sweetness of artificial flowers. On the wall hung framed certificates in gold borders, their perfection sterile and comforting. I sat in one of the leather chairs, my hands folded in my lap, and watched the rain streak down the window. I felt no nervousness, only the weight of finality, the calm gravity of someone who has already lived through worse storms. After a few minutes, Clara appeared, her dark hair pulled into a loose knot, her expression calm but alert. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded. Inside her office, the table was already arranged, 2 stacks of documents, a pen that gleamed faintly under the overhead light, and a single blue folder marked Transfer of Title. I knew what was inside. Over the past few weeks, she had guided me through the process of consolidating my ownership of the building, ensuring that every legal thread was tied in my name alone. Today's signature would make it official, not just a home I lived in, but a property that carried my authority, my independence, my story. I sat down, and for a moment my eyes blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer weight of the moment pressing outward through the body. "It's all here," Clara said gently. "Once you sign, it's done. No one can challenge it." I took the pen in my hand, felt its balance, its quiet promise. The ink flowed easily, black and certain, my name forming itself across the paper with a steadiness that surprised me. Each stroke felt like the closing of a wound. When I finished, I placed the pen down carefully and exhaled. Clara smiled. "That's it," she said. "You're officially the sole owner." The words echoed inside me like a bell. For a long time, I couldn't speak. I only stared at the papers, the thin layers of legality that had the power to make something invisible visible again. My name, written plainly, unshared, unqualified. Mine. I had lived a long life of shared things, shared homes, shared debts, shared silences. This was the first time something existed under my name alone, with no one standing behind or above it. It felt both enormous and intimate, as if the world had quietly rearranged itself to make space for me. Clara gathered the documents and placed them in a folder, then looked at me with that steady gaze of women who have fought too many quiet battles to waste time on ceremony. "How does it feel?" she asked. I thought for a moment. "It feels," I said slowly, like I just unlocked a door I didn't know was closed. She nodded. That's usually how freedom works. We laughed softly, the sound filling the room like something sacred. When I stepped outside, the rain had stopped completely. The clouds had thinned to a pale gray, and the air smelled faintly of wet pavement and new beginnings. I walked home slowly, carrying the folder close to my chest, and every step felt lighter than the last. The city was alive with small details I had never noticed before. The glint of sunlight on puddles, the rhythm of shoes on sidewalks, the laughter of school children echoing from a block away. For so many years, I had moved through the world unseen, a ghost of convenience drifting through other people's schedules. Now, every passerby seemed to look at me differently, or perhaps it was I who looked differently at them. Freedom changes the lens, not the landscape. When I reached my building, I stood for a long time across the street, simply looking at it. The bricks glistened from the rain, the windows reflected the sky, and the faint hum of life pulsed inside. The tenants' footsteps, the kettle whistling in my kitchen upstairs, the gentle vibration of pipes carrying warmth through the structure I had revived. It was not grand, not perfect, but it was alive. I crossed the street and climbed the steps, pausing for a moment at the threshold. The key turned easily in the lock, the sound precise, intimate. Inside, the air carried the scent of coffee and paint and something else. Something like courage taking shape. I went up to the second floor, the room that had become a refuge for strangers who needed quiet. The walls were lined now with small traces of their presence. A forgotten scarf, a stack of well-thumbed magazines, a note pinned to the wall that read, "Thank you for the tea." I sat in the old armchair by the window and opened the folder, looking again at the signed papers. The ink was dry, the lines exact, but what they represented felt vast and immeasurable. I thought of the basement I had once been told fit me, of how long I had believed that comfort was something other people granted. Now I understood that dignity is not a gift to be given. It is a right reclaimed. Outside, the sound of footsteps drew my attention. I looked down and saw a familiar figure walking along the sidewalk, umbrella in hand, head tilted down. My son-in-law. He had aged, though not in the way grief ages people. Rather, it was the kind of aging that comes from living too long inside control, the brittleness of a man whose world had stopped expanding. He paused briefly in front of my building, glanced at the door, and then continued walking without looking up. He didn't recognize me in the window, though I recognized the weight of his stride, the arrogance dimmed now by time. I didn't feel anger, only distance. Once, his laughter had defined the perimeter of my humiliation. Now it was nothing more than a sound that had lost its echo. I watched until he disappeared around the corner, and then I whispered to the glass, "You were right. It did fit me once, but only because I was bent." As the sky cleared, sunlight spilled through the window, filling the room with that golden, forgiving light that makes even the ordinary seem extraordinary. I gathered the papers, placed them back into the folder, and carried them upstairs to my apartment. On the kitchen counter, I set them down beside my teacup and the photograph of my granddaughter. I imagined her reading the letter I had sent, maybe folding it carefully, maybe hiding it somewhere safe. One day, I thought, she would come to me, and I would show her this building, this life rebuilt from the ashes of politeness. I would tell her that the measure of a woman is not how quietly she endures, but how fully she reclaims what was stolen from her voice. That evening, as dusk fell, I unlocked the door to the basement and went down for the first time since the repairs were complete. The air was cool and clean now, the walls newly painted, the floor swept smooth. In the corner stood the same chair and lamp I had placed there on my first day, waiting patiently through all the seasons of change. I sat down and turned on the lamp. The light spread softly across the walls, reaching the farthest corners of the room that had once symbolized my diminishment. Now it felt different, anchored, solid, necessary. I realized I didn't need to erase the basement to overcome it. I needed to own it. I whispered into the space, not as confession, but as benediction. This is where I began again. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, resonant, alive. When I climbed the stairs and closed the door behind me, I felt an almost physical lightness. The house seemed to exhale with me, as though we had both completed something essential. I poured myself a small glass of wine and stood by the window, watching the city darken into night. Below, the streetlights flickered on, one by one, like promises being kept. I raised the glass slightly, not in a toast to revenge or triumph, but to endurance, the kind that bends but never breaks. The pen I had used to sign the papers lay on the table beside me, glinting in the lamplight. I picked it up, held it between my fingers, and thought, this is what power feels like when it's quiet. Then I placed it carefully back on the table, next to the deed that carried my name, and whispered to the empty room, it's done. Outside, the rain began again, softer this time, like applause heard from far away. Winter receded slowly that year, as though reluctant to let go of the cold it had kept folded inside the city for months. The days lengthened imperceptibly, each one pulling a little more light through the windows of my apartment, until one morning I woke to find the air soft again, the street below alive with movement, and the familiar scent of thawed earth rising through the cracks of the pavement. The building, my building, felt different in this light. The walls seemed to hum. The radiators clicked like small hearts beating in time with the new season. I spent that morning walking from room to room, touching the things that had come to define my quiet life. The teacup with the crack in its rim, the faded rug, the chair near the window where the sunlight gathered. Nothing had changed, yet everything had settled into a rhythm that felt final, not in the sense of ending, but of completion. There was no longer a wound to manage, no secret to protect, no noise from above reminding me to stay small. The house had become an extension of my breathing. It no longer demanded proof of ownership because it already carried my scent, my voice, my history in every wall. I understood then that peace is not given. It is practiced, the same way courage is practiced, not through grand gestures, but through repetition, through choosing calm every day, even when memory presses against the edges of it. My granddaughter came to visit in early spring. She arrived unannounced, her hair longer than I remembered, her eyes a mirror of my daughter's, but softened by youth. She stood at the threshold for a moment, uncertain, the afternoon light casting her shadow across the hallway. I felt my heart stutter, that fragile rhythm of joy laced with disbelief. She smiled shyly, lifting a small suitcase as if to prove her intention. I found you, she said simply, and her voice carried the tremor of both victory and apology. I opened the door wider and stepped aside. Of course you did, I replied. I've been right here. She crossed the threshold hesitantly, her gaze moving over the framed pictures on the walls, the worn furniture, the vase of wilted tulips on the table. It's smaller than I imagined, she said, then added quickly, but warm. I laughed, not at her, but at the echo of my son-in-law's words long ago. The same word, turned inside out. Warm. Yes, warmth was the right word for this place, the kind that doesn't impress, but stays. We spent that evening talking in the kitchen. I cooked, she helped, and the air filled with the scent of garlic and slow laughter, the kind that rises cautiously between people who are learning how to trust again. She told me about her studies, about the silence at home when my name came up, about her plan to move out as soon as she could. I listened, nodding, sometimes reaching out to touch her hand when her voice trembled. They were afraid, I said finally, not of losing me, but of what my leaving revealed about themselves. She looked at me, puzzled. What did it reveal? That love built on control isn't love, I said. It's dependency dressed as devotion, and when you remove yourself from it, it collapses, not because you destroyed it, but because it was never strong enough to stand. She thought about that quietly, stirring her tea. I don't want to end up like them, she said softly. Then learn to be alone without calling it loneliness, I replied. It's a skill no one teaches, but it's the only one that makes freedom bearable. When she left 2 days later, she hugged me tightly, the kind of hug that holds both gratitude and grief. Will you be here when I come back? She asked. Always, I said, though we both knew that always is a word that belongs more to hope than to time. After she left, the building felt strangely alive, as if her presence had stirred something in the walls. I walked to the window and watched her disappear down the street, her figure small but bright against the fading light. For a moment, I imagined my daughter as she had been at that age, defiant, hopeful, certain that the world would yield to her if she only pushed hard enough. I wished, not for the first time, that she might someday stand where her daughter had stood and understand, finally, that strength does not come from dominance, but from the courage to release. But I no longer carried anger for her. Anger is a useful fire for a time, but eventually it burns too hot to live beside. What remained now was clarity, cool and luminous, the kind that lets you see people not as villains, but as fragile architects of their own fear. As the months passed, the Thursday gatherings continued, though less frequently. The women came and went, their stories shifting with the seasons. Some brought plants to leave on the windowsills. Others left notes or books behind. Once, a woman I barely knew stopped by just to say, "It helps to know this place exists." That sentence stayed with me for days, turning itself over in my mind. Existence. That was what I had fought for, what all of us had fought for in one way or another. Not success, not approval, not even love, but the simple right to exist on our own terms. The building had become a small sanctuary for that truth, and every sound within it, the creak of the stairs, the slam of a door, the low hum of the pipes, felt like confirmation that existence itself is resistance. In late summer, I repainted the front door. It had faded to a dull brown over the years, and I wanted something that announced quiet confidence rather than apology. I chose a deep blue, the color of twilight just before it turns to night. As I brushed the paint on, the smell of turpentine mingling with the scent of lilac from the garden, I thought about all the doors I had walked through in my life, and all the ones that had been closed to me, some by others, some by fear. This one, I realized, would be the last door I would ever need to open for myself. It was not the entrance to a house. It was the threshold of my own choosing. On the anniversary of the day I left my daughter's house, I found myself in the basement again, sweeping the floor though it was already clean. The chair still stood in the corner, the lamp still cast its soft circle of light. I sat for a long time, listening to the faint murmur of life above me. I no longer associated this space with humiliation or exile. It had become something else entirely, a reminder that beginnings are often disguised as endings, that descent is sometimes the only way to find ground firm enough to rise from. I closed my eyes and thought of the first night I slept here after leaving, of the cold air, the fear, the trembling. How far I had walked from that moment to this one. I whispered into the quiet, not as confession, but as acknowledgement. It fits me still, but now on my terms. The air seemed to hold the words, then absorb them, as though the walls themselves understood. When I went back upstairs, the sun was setting, filling the rooms with that late golden light that makes everything appear softer, more merciful. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched as the street lamps flickered on one by one. People hurried home, their silhouettes elongated by the glow, and somewhere in the distance a child laughed, a high, unguarded sound that pierced the evening like a note of forgiveness. I thought of all the women I had met, all the quiet acts of endurance stitched invisibly through the world. We are not extraordinary, I realized. We are simply survivors who have refused to stay buried. And in that refusal, there is a kind of grace. Before turning in, I wrote one last letter. It wasn't to my daughter or even to my granddaughter, though I addressed it to the women who come after. I told them that dignity is not granted by anyone else's permission, that sometimes freedom begins with the smallest motion, a packed bag, a single step, a closed door. I told them that pain will demand its due, but peace will wait patiently for its turn, and when it comes, it will not shout. It will arrive like a quiet morning after rain, asking nothing, offering everything. I signed it simply with my name, full and unbroken, and left it on the table by the window. The night deepened around the building, the city exhaled, and I sat in the fading light with a stillness that was neither loneliness nor triumph, but something finer, the soft weight of completion. I thought again of my son-in-law's voice all those years ago, that careless laughter drifting down to the basement. I could almost hear it, and then it faded, replaced by the slow, steady pulse of my own breathing. The last thought I had before sleep was simple, clear, and without bitterness. Yes, the basement fit me once, but now the sky does too.